These are the forgotten islands that America actually did buy from Denmark. They renamed them the US Virgin Islands as part of a deal that also saw them recognise Danish control of Greenland. But to understand why, we need to look at their history of failing to acquire these islands in the past, the surprising involvements of both Germany and one of America's most famous founding fathers, and why the local population still live in a weird political no man's land to this day. Within just 100 years of Christopher Columbus first encountering this chain of islands in the Caribbean in 1493, the way of life of their inhabitants had already reached near extinction. They had survived conflicts with other indigenous peoples for thousands of years, but would not survive the arrival of Spanish guns and Spanish diseases, which left the islands suddenly sparsely populated and the door wide open for other powers to arrive. As with any island that's left unsupervised for too long, Britain soon comes in and claims all of these ones. But rather charitably, they leave these to be squabbled over by France, the Netherlands and Spain, who eventually agree that nobody wants them. And so Denmark seizes its chance to join the scramble for the Caribbean, claiming these as the Danish West Indies in 1672. With the Danes already having taken land in what is now Ghana, they're now knee-deep in the transatlantic slave trade. They possess both their own slave ports and their own sugar plantations, and they spend the next 100 years getting filthy rich off of this exploitation, kidnapping African people and forcing them to work here in unthinkable conditions. The biggest possible contrast to how we see the islands today as this peaceful, beautiful landscape. Interestingly, considering the USA hasn't even been formed yet, one of their most famous ever figures is actually here during this period, securing the islands a place in American folklore before it even existed. In 1772, a teenage Alexander Hamilton, yes, that one, who was born in the Caribbean under British rule, is working here on the Danish islands when they're hit by a hurricane. He writes a letter including such a vivid account of the disaster that it's noticed and published by local landowners who recognise his promise and collectively fund a scholarship for him to go and be educated in New York, with obvious consequences for the whole USA existing thing. He and all of the other founding fathers would find the Virgin Islands' current situation today a complete disgrace, for reasons that we'll see in a minute. But during this storm, Hamilton managed to write himself out of poverty, while the exact opposite happened to everybody else. More and more hurricanes arrive in the next decades, including one that's followed by an earthquake and then a tsunami, devastating the entire chain of islands. A series of successful slave revolts further weakened Denmark's grip, and with the abolition of slavery and the rise of huge rival economies in Brazil and Cuba, the colony's economic boom is long gone. Thankfully for them though, the US does exist by this point and is on the exact opposite trajectory, looking for any and all opportunities to manifest a little more destiny. One of the Danish West Indies islands, St. Thomas, has one of the biggest and most easily defensible deepwater ports in the entire region, so of course the US Navy is eyeing this up. They love the sound of turning this whole place into one big coaling station, and in 1867 they make their first attempt, proposing a treaty to buy these islands for the equivalent of about $150 million in today's money. And Denmark agrees to it, but US Secretary of State William Seward fails to get it through the Senate, partly because nobody wants to deal with Hurricane Island, and partly because nobody likes him. Just 6 months prior, he had purchased Alaska from Russia, which seems like an obvious smart move to us today, but at the time it was ridiculed so badly that nobody wanted to hear any new ideas from him anymore. But fast forward 30 years and the US has a new president, Teddy Roosevelt, whose tunnel vision on the canalification of this nearby thin strip of land gives new impetus to taking over these islands. Surely whoever can get a Panama Canal to work can't let that juicy looking naval port so near to its entrance fall into a rival's hands. It has to be owned by the US, and so they pick up their big stick and go back in with attempt number 2. They offer Denmark slightly less this time and even get it through the US Senate, but it dies in the Danish parliament this time by one single vote. And American diplomats at the time actually blame this on the Kaiser, accusing him of meddling in Danish affairs due to the rumours that he was actively trying to buy the islands himself for Germany. But give it time. The First World War is going to change everything. America finally opens its golden goose down in Panama, right as Europe erupts into war. During World War I, Denmark is officially neutral, but the US is still nervous. If Germany goes rogue and annexes mainland Denmark, will they automatically take the Danish West Indies? If so, the Kaiser's navy would suddenly be a menace to us on our very doorstep, gaining a new submarine pen from which to patrol the entrance to our shiny new canal, and generally setting fire to the Monroe Doctrine. If this sounded like paranoia at the time, it became very real when that Kaiser's navy went and did something that historians have since called very stupid. While the Lusitania is on a journey from New York in 1915, Germany torpedoes it for some reason, killing over 100 American citizens and broadcasting to every propaganda department in the world that German U-boats really are out here acting menacingly in the Atlantic. A lot of the best Empire stories do involve ships like that, and the Lusitania is one of the most fascinating. I'm actually planning to cover that story in more detail as a separate video soon, so subscribe if you're interested in that. But it's no surprise that within a year of that attack, Washington was back at the table for attempt number 3 at getting the islands. Only this time they were coming from a place of urgency and emotion, and so Denmark was able to get an even better deal out of them. The USA offered way more money, roughly 700 million in today's dollars, amounting to over 3 times Denmark's annual national budget, which, isn't bad for some unproductive islands that were draining their coffers. But more than that, crucially, Denmark also gets the US to recognize their sovereignty over all of Greenland. This was a huge move, essentially the US saying that they needed these islands so badly that they were willing to back off from ever approaching Denmark about Greenland. They knew that their recognition would probably cause a domino effect of other large powers doing the same, and so this was kind of a no backsies situation. But of course, they were desperate. Denmark held a referendum in which 2/3 of their people approved of sealing this deal. Unsurprisingly, that only included mainland Danes, not islanders, but an unofficial poll on the islands did see over 99% approval of being transferred to the US. And in early 1917, President Woodrow Wilson announced the agreement, and then, just 5 days later, America's entry into the war. So, why hasn't life under the Stars and Stripes been plain sailing for the local population? The islands were initially just run by the military as simply a naval outpost with no consideration for local government. Racial segregation and Jim Crow-style policies worsened the discrimination suffered by locals, 9 out of 10 of whom descended from freed West African slaves, and languages other than English were suppressed as part of the Americanization of local cultures. It took another 15 years of campaigning for islanders to get full US citizenship, but even that doesn't bring all the perks that it would if they lived in a true state. The drip feeding of self-government to the islands has since seen them gain the right to send somebody to the US Congress since 1972, and this is currently Stacey Plaskett, who was born in New York to 2 Virgin Islander parents, which sounds good, but the huge caveat is that while she can speak in the House of Representatives, she can't vote on final bills. Despite its reputation as a tax haven though, Virgin Islanders are charged some taxes, but because they're not a state, they still can't vote for president. Try explaining that one to local hero Alexander No Taxation Without Representation Hamilton. Puerto Rico, with a much bigger population and economy, is the one that's seen by some as the next cab off the rank to become the 51st state, but even they are still an afterthought in US politics, leaving the Virgin Islands as an afterthought to an afterthought. But for now, because they can't vote, no politician needs to serve their interests, and so situations like the devastating double hurricane of 2017 fall on deaf ears. Some islanders have left for the mainland, creating notable communities of Virgin Islanders in places like New York and Florida, and among those that stayed behind, some do argue that they are better off now than they were before, because at least they're under US protection, and maybe it's better to be at the end of Washington's list of priorities than go independent and not be on it at all. If you'd like to learn more niche and fascinating empire stories, then don't forget to subscribe while you're here and join the members club if you'd like to support the channel. And if you'd like to learn more about the US's relationship with Greenland, then you can click here to watch this video next.